In this section, we're going to look at how to do the locomotive checks on both Graham Alexander and Lady of the Lakes. Now internally, these two locomotives are near enough identical, so we're going to be focusing our attention on Graham Alexander, and where there are differences, I will point them out on Lady of the Lakes during the video. The very first thing to do is to ensure that the locomotive can be used. Check the fleet fault report book in the mess room and check that there's no stop signs attached to the locomotive. If there are, do not use it. Before we start doing any checks, we need to ensure that the locomotive is securely stabled and out the way of any other trains. It's recommended to do the checks at the very start of the day before the engine has had a chance to get warmed up. Ensure that the handbrake is applied. On Graham Alexander and Lady of the Lakes, this is behind the driver's seat and is a screw type handbrake. Turn the handbrake wheel clockwise. This will apply the handbrake. Keep turning until you can feel the handbrake tightening. You can check that the handbrake is on by turning the ignition switch to the number 1 setting and then checking for this handbrake light to illuminate on the dashboard. Once you're satisfied that the locomotive is securely stabled, remove the ignition key. Keep this on you and in your pocket whilst you're doing the checks. This will reduce the risk of someone coming along and starting the locomotive up whilst you've got your hands in the engine compartment. We now need to gain access to the engine compartment. This is achieved by removing these two panels on this side and the other two panels on the other side. On Graham Alexander, there are 4 locks on each panel. However, on Lady of the Lakes, there are only 2 locks per panel. In each cab to the left of the throttle, you will find one of these T-keys. Remove the T-key. Insert the T-key and turn it to unlock it. When you get to the last lock, place your other hand on the panel to prevent it from falling out. There are 2 pegs at the bottom of each panel, preventing the panel from completely falling out. You will need to lift up the panel so that these pegs are clear of the frame. Place the panel on the ground and lean it gently up against the locomotive. Starting from the front to the back, you've got the battery, the transmission, the gearbox, the engine, the radiator and the air tanks. One thing you should be doing when you're doing the engine checks is always looking out at the general condition of everything inside the locomotive. Pay particular attention to the pipes and wires. You're checking for any damage and anything that looks like it's come off from something. We're going to start in the engine compartment with the battery. First of all, just have a general look at it, make sure there's no leaks or cracks on it, and then you just need to check that the wires are securely attached to each of the 2 terminals. Do this by checking the wires that go to each terminal, by giving them a little wiggle, make sure there's no play. Do not touch the metal parts, only the plastic coating on the wires. The next thing to check is the oil level in the engine, and the dipstick for this can be found just here. You're going to need some rag or some paper towel now. Usually there's a roll of paper towel in the back of the locomotive. If there's not, you can find this in the workshop or the P-way depot. Conveniently for us, here's a nice fresh roll. With one hand holding the paper towel, use your other hand to reach in and pull out the dipstick. Wipe it. Then put the dipstick back into the engine. Leave it for a couple of seconds and then extract it again. This time you're checking that the oil level is between the maximum and the minimum marker on it. This notch here is the minimum and this notch here is the maximum. As you can see, the oil level is halfway between the 2, so this is satisfactory. Once you've done that and you're happy with the results, you can replace the dipstick. If the engine oil is too low, do not fill it. Put the locomotive back in the shed, remove it from traffic and fill out a fault report. It's worth bearing in mind that on Lady of the Lakes, the engine oil, although is in the same place, there is an additional dipstick on this side, which is the transmission oil. On Graham Alexander, this is on the other side. We've come around to the other side of the locomotive now, and the first thing to check is that the brake isolation valve is in the upright position at 12 o'clock. This is telling us that the brakes on this locomotive have not been isolated. The brake isolation valve for Lady of the Lakes is located behind this small panel on the right hand side of the locomotive. Here is the isolation valve here, And with the handle in line with the pipe, that shows that the brakes are not isolated. And if it is turned 90 degrees with the handle pointing towards the ground, that means the brakes on the locomotive are isolated. We now need to check that the fan belt is on nice and tight. This is why it is critical that you keep the key in your pocket at all times, because when the locomotive is operational, the belt and the fan are spinning at thousands and thousands of revolutions per minute, and you don't want to get your finger caught in there because it won't come out again. This is the fan belt. Gently pull on the belt to ensure that it is nice and tight. If the belt is loose or is fraying or there's any other damage on it, remove the locomotive from service and fill in a fault report. Now this next bit can sometimes be the trickiest part of doing the locomotive checks. We need to check the coolant level in the radiator. This here is the radiator, and we need to remove the filler cap. The filler cap is located in the middle of the radiator on the top. It is extremely important that when you are checking the coolant level in the radiator that you do this when the engine is cold. If the engine has been running for some considerable time, the water will be extremely hot and you could burn yourself. You've got to reach up inside the locomotive and undo the filler cap. Press the cap down and turn anti-clockwise. Admittedly, some people find it difficult to access the filler cap by reaching up like this. An alternative is to remove the cap on the top of the locomotive, and you can access the cap from the top. If you're feeling really energetic, you could haul yourself up onto the locomotive and reach down, like so. Now if the water level in the radiator is low, you are allowed to top it up. However, please don't overfill it. If you don't feel confident doing this, simply put the locomotive back in the shed, fill out a fault report and use another locomotive. In exactly the same way that we check the engine oil, remove the dipstick, wipe it and replace it. Leave it for a couple of seconds and then remove it. Now the oil in the transmission is clear, so it's quite difficult to see, but we can see it is above the minimum notch, which is just there. The last thing to check in the engine compartment is to ensure there's no moisture in this air dryer. To get rid of any excess moisture, simply pull on this toggle for a couple of seconds and any moisture will exit the tank. So we've now completed all the checks in the engine compartment, so now we need to replace the panels. Now that we've completed all the checks in the back of the locomotive, we're now going to turn our attention to the bogies and the braking equipment. Before we started the checks, we made sure that the locomotive was securely stabled. That included applying the handbrake. It is vital that the handbrake remains applied for this next part. These are the brake blocks, and at the moment you can see they're fully applied. The brake handle is also in the on position. We now need to check that these brake blocks are releasing properly when the brakes are released. To do that, release the brakes. You just need to go around to each wheel now and just check that this brake block is loose. You can see there that that one is off. Repeat this process on all wheels. So I like to use the end of the T key just to give each brake block a little wiggle. That way I keep my hands nice and clean. The other thing you're looking at when you're down looking at the brake blocks is just generally looking at the bogie, making sure that there's nothing hanging off, there's no obvious damage, and if there is, you would take the locomotive out of service and fill out a fault report. What I'm doing at the rear here is just checking the coupling looks all okay, there's no obvious damage there. The electric cable is looking all okay, no obvious damage. And finally, again, the pipe just looking for any obvious damage. Then we do a quick release. And we can hear that's all okay. Once you check the connections on the rear of the locomotive, head to the front and do exactly the same there. Once you're happy with all that, reapply the brakes. And the last part of the engine checks is to finish off in the cab and just check that everything's working in here. Take out the ignition key and turn it one position to the electrics. Once the key's on and the electrics are on, you'll see some lights will illuminate on the dashboard and you'll hear the clock ticking. We're now going to check that the headlights are operational. The headlights is this one. Press the switch forward to turn on the front headlight and go round to the front of the locomotive and check that that's illuminated. Do the same for the rear and check that that's illuminated. If either of the headlights don't work, remove the locomotive from service. We'll now check the wipers, which is the next switch. And then the next switch is the interior light. And then finally, the last switch illuminates the dials on the dashboard. One cab control that must be working is the horn. We need to test the buzzer system, so turn that on and press the test button. You can acknowledge that and that will turn that off. Finally, we need to check that the radio is powering up. Press the power on button, wait for it to boot up. Usually we'll always be operating on channel 2, which allows everybody to speak to everybody else. However, if radio control is open, you will need to change the channel to number 1. With the engine running, check all the gauges are operating normally and that there's enough fuel. We now just need to check that the throttle is working and that the dead man's pedal is also working. So turn on the locomotive. Rev the engine until the battery starts charging. And we've already established there that the throttle is working nicely. And now we need to check that the engine will stall when we would take our foot off the dead man's pedal. So to check, put your foot on the pedal, put the locomotive into gear, release the air brakes, and simply remove your foot off the pedal. The engine should stall and the brakes should apply. Reset the controls. Lady of the Lakes is the only locomotive to have this alarm. This means that there is low air. Before moving, you need to charge up the air tanks on Lady of the Lakes. Do this until the alarm stops sounding. You'll also be able to check the gauge. When turning Robert, Graham Alexander, Bayhurst or John Rennie off, it is simply a case of turning the key off. Remember that with Lady of the Lakes, when the engine is running, you need to depress the button first, let the engine stop, and then you can turn the key off. And there you are, the locomotive has now been checked and is ready for service. Once you've completed the locomotive checks, you'll need to fill in this section of the train trip sheet, placing the locomotive name here, signing it, and printing your name. And that concludes the locomotive checks for Graham Alexander and Lady of the Lakes.